it's a very strange thing. Reality is made out of language. And for most of the people in this room, it's made out of English. And yet we spend a great deal of time worrying about quarks and mu mesons and electromagnetic radiation. And all this is entirely a fiction. None of this stuff exists. All that exists are words. By the time a child is 8 or 9 or 5 or 6, they have covered the entirety of reality with these interlocking little linguistic tiles. And nowhere now is reality to be found. Between ourselves and reality, as quickly as we possibly can, we erect a lie. It's all tied up with our fear of death. You know, we assume that if we release ourselves into this flow, we will be swept away, that our identity will cease to exist, that we will somehow not be there. This is an artifact of language. It's a horrible misunderstanding about who we are and how the whole system is working.
Hello everyone, my name is James Gesso. I am the host of Adventures Through the Mind, and I'm here today to talk about Terence McKenna. If you don't already know who Terence McKenna is, then chances are this is not the right video for you. You might want to just basically search his name, and thousands of very interesting videos will come up for you to explore a deeper understanding of who he is. For me, Terence has been a role model for a good portion of my career, which I'm going to unpack a little bit more. But the reason I want to talk to you about my own perspectives on Terence today is that throughout my podcast, I've had multiple guests that have come on, and they have had some pretty critical views of Terence McKenna, which I have felt very important to spotlight, because there is a lot of issue, or at least for a while there was a perceived issue of people not really engaging his content in a healthy way, kind of putting him on a guru pedestal, like the kind of pedestal that he never would have actually wanted, and something that I think might be quite detrimental to a person's understanding of themselves and a greater understanding of navigating the psychedelic experience. So to start us off, I'm going to just show you some clips of some of these episodes. Each of the points I'm going to show here are some criticisms that my guests have offered that, to a more or less degree, I share. We're going to start with Martin Ball, then we're going to go into James Kent, and we're going to finish up with a Facebook post that came from Daniel Waterman as a criticism to my recent Top 5 Influential Books on the Psychedelic Experience video. Here we go.
To pick up on one of the terms that you used here, is that people do treat Terence McKenna religiously. And in fact, it's been quite specific when, I've made my own commentaries of Terence McKenna. And sometimes people come back and say, how dare you insult our prophet? When we treat Terence McKenna as some kind of religious figure, or think that everything that he says is holy and sacrosanct, that we're really cutting ourselves off from our own deeper explorations. I find that deeply troubling, that we are within, and I say we more broadly, within the entheogenic and psychedelic communities, that this person is not openly critiqued, that, hey, he made very specific predictions about what he thought 2012 was about, and he's completely wrong. Nothing that he said is actually accurate in any way, shape, or form. So then why the adulation? Why is there so much attention given to the words that this man says when they're wrong? And I think that that's something that people ought to acknowledge within the psychedelic community, that yes, he's a great inspiration. He's a great speaker. He seems like a fun guy, but he also was deeply wrong.
Okay, so he gets so far out there into outer space, and he's talking about DMT elves and all of this other crazy stuff about dimensions and hyperdimensional space. Now, the farther he went off on the rails, now he was just, I think, a storyteller at first, and he was just kind of going off on a lark. Like, I have these ideas. They're big ideas. Maybe they're crazy ideas, but I'm going to spin them. And he was such a good storyteller that people loved him and they wanted more. And as he became more famous and as he became more popular, he also became more isolated and withdrawn. And at the height of his success in the community, his family was falling apart. He got a divorce. He became estranged from his kids for a while. He moved to a really isolated spot on the big island of Hawaii and just surrounded himself with like fans and sycophants who were just there to sort of, you know, say, yeah, Terence, way to go. You're the man. And by isolating himself in that bubble, I think he lost perspective of what was real and what was true. And, you know, maybe lost the respect of his family and lost a lot of, you know, the social, I mean, a lot, his family was going to, you know, have him put in an institution for a while because he just couldn't stop talking about this stuff, the time wave, how the world was going to end in 2012 and the I Ching and the time wave. And the farther he got into the time wave and the more people got interested in this sort of end of the world rap that he had, the farther away he got from anybody who was actually going to be open and honest with him as a human being. He became a cartoon character of himself. He became a caricature of Terence McKenna. No longer the man, but the guru. And
which is exactly what he preached against.
I really felt sad at the end when he got sick and he was kind of alone. I mean, he had a girlfriend at that point who was taking care of him, and a couple of friends and caretakers that were taking care of him. But it was really members of the psychedelic community who were like going out to visit him and help him out in those later days, because he didn't really have any family left that he can count on, except for, you know, Dennis helped him out, of course. His younger brother was gonna be there for him. But it was sad, I thought, at the end, to see how kind of isolated and alone he became, even though people see him as like you know, really successful and really popular and having a huge following worldwide. I think he was, in the end, really kind of alone and alienated. And it made me definitely think I don't want to end up like that.
McKenna, while admittedly much loved, was a terrible fantast who ranted and raved and whose entire opus is very little use to those first setting out on the psychedelic path of self-examination. Indeed, one might gather then Terence himself never set out on that trip at all. Point to be considered, Daniel goes on a little bit longer, kind of taking Terence down to a degree in which I don't personally agree with. If you'd like to read that whole post, a link to it will be contained in the description below, and then you can basically make your own decision as to how you feel about Daniel's criticisms. Another thing to consider here in regards to Terence as an example of how to engage the psychedelic experience, and that example being problematic, is the fact that Terence actually stopped taking psychedelics at one point, where you could say, and I like to think that the very manner in which he advocated taking psychedelics was the manner of taking psychedelics that ended up to him being disturbed by them and stepping back for a really long time. In the clip you're going to hear in a second, which is from a London Real episode where Dennis McKenna, Terence's brother, was interviewed, you'll hear Dennis talking about Terence no longer taking psychedelics and the reason Dennis feels that he stopped.
He stopped taking psychedelics, or stopped taking them regularly and at high doses at a certain period in his life, like the early 90s. And this was part of the crisis of his life, I think, that he was in at that time. He was having existential anxiety in a certain way, and he was beginning to question a lot of things. And I think, he was having personal issues, and he was questioning his whole career and the time wave and everything, his marriage, his public role, and all that. And I think that it was hard on him. And I used to say, and I think that's true to a certain extent, I used to say that, he stopped taking psychedelics regularly when it stopped really being about the alien and the other, and it became more about himself and looking at himself through that mirror, and that was uncomfortable when he stepped back from it. That was part of our, I would say conflict, but part of the thing that, when we were not seeing eye to eye during that period, I was critical of that. I was saying, well, look, you're the main spokesman for psychedelics in the world. That's how you're presenting yourself. You're not taking psychedelics. So what's going on? You need to be walking your talk if you're going to do this. And he resented it. But I was honest. And he resented it because he knew there was some truth to it.
What isn't included in the clip at the end is an important point about Dennis saying, Terence took his fair share of high-dose psychedelics, and he certainly doesn't have to apologize for whatever decision he made in regards to stopping his psychedelic use. He, again, had his fair share. It's actually quite an excellent interview. I'll leave a link to it in the description to this video. So although I have these criticisms of Terence McKenna, my approach has kind of shifted over time. Where it is now is ultimately, I love him. I think he's great. But I think he's great with some caveats, which I'll get into at the end. But first, let me explain to you why I say that Terence McKenna is a role model and has been a role model for me. And it's gone through multiple different stages. The first stage of my, role modeling with Terence McKenna was pretty much the unfettered assimilation of his ideas into my own views on the world. I would listen to him and he would just send me into these bewildering and positive and beautiful and curious states of mind. And I kind of bought it hook, line, and sinker. At one point before I started this whole thing here with Adventures Through the Mind, this whole public advocacy for psychedelic research and conversations around the nature and implications of the psychedelic experience, I was working at a cafe and I was sweeping up the floor one night. And at this point, I had been writing my book. I had started writing Decomposing the Shadow, longhand in my friend's house in front of her window on her sewing desk. And I was really struggling with putting my ideas onto paper. And I thought to myself, I have no problem with telling people these ideas, sharing them in a real-time conversation when I speak them, but I struggle so much to write them down. And I thought, what am I going to do about this? And as I'm doing this, I look over and I see a local magazine. And on the cover is this woman who I had met through the tea house multiple times and was a really friendly person, a member of the community. And she is on there spitting fire. And it says on the cover of the magazine, Calgarians getting paid to do what they love. Immediately, I decided in my head, that's it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go public and speak publicly about psychedelics. I'm going to make this a career. I'm going to make this the creative life path that nourishes my capacity to continue on this journey of exploration and knowledge and truth, or at least attempts and inquiries towards truth, and be financially and socially nourished by it. This is what I'm going to do. And I saw Terence McKenna as the archetype of what that might look like. So again, he was the role model. I could do it. Terence McKenna did it. I could do it. Now, as I went on, that sort of that first unfettered assimilation of his ideas, just the hook, line, and sinker approach that I had, started to shift the greater that I thought about his work and thought about the criticisms that I'd been hearing. And I kind of got on this anti-Terence McKenna mode. So the first phase was this wild adoption. Just take it all in. Why not? It's real. Sure. Great. It sounded great. It made sort of logical sense, although it mostly made sense in like a circular reasoning, self-contained delusional type reality sense. Yeah, let's take it. And then the second one was a total rejection. He became a role model for what not to do. I did not want to become like Terence McKenna. I did not want to speak a bunch of it's hard to say. I'm going to say it, but it might not be the most accurate reflection of my thoughts on it, but like just irrational, wild, metaphysical conjecture. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a representative of that. I don't want to be this new agey bullshit woo-woo person, which at that point I had been and kind of lost track of because of a very turbulent ayahuasca experience, which I'll put a link to the essay I wrote about that experience in the description below. But I basically made McKenna the role model of where I didn't want to go. I did not want to become this eccentric person that, seemed almost like a high-functioning schizophrenic. I didn't want to go there. At least that was my perspectives at the time. In a way, aligning with sort of James Kent's story that you just heard earlier about where McKenna went. I didn't want to become that person. I didn't want to dissociate myself from my friends and family. I didn't want to go so far in this path that I couldn't come back to living at least a somewhat baseline normal life. I didn't want to establish my whole sense of self, especially my whole career, on a bunch of metaphysical conjecture and abstraction. So before I get into the third phase, which is where I'm at now with Terence McKenna, I want to make another point about how Terence McKenna's work and what he inspired in me both harmed me and offered me benefit. For example, here's this clip from that the top 5 most influential books on the psychedelic experience video that I mentioned previously. It was just such an incredible psychedelic adventure novel and really awakened a sense of like going out there and doing it. It really sort of was like, yeah, I want to go out there and go to the jungle and, go off on these adventures and just, I see, I'm struggling for the words to talk about how like awesome it was to read it and how influential it was. That being said, that very same inspiration got me into some trouble when I ended up harming myself multiple times on these types of adventures. So Terence McKenna, especially True Hallucinations, he was just so interesting and the story sounded so adventurous and I wanted adventure. I wanted, the mythic hero's journey. I wanted to be interesting. I wanted to be Indiana Jones, ever since I was a kid. And so it was like he gave me the inspiration for this reckless entanglement with being the Indiana Jones of the mind. I wanted to go to the jungle. I wanted to drink the brews. I wanted to take the psychedelics. I wanted to climb to the mountains of my own intellectual capacity and take this sense of reality to a whole new twisted domain. Not to say that lifestyle isn't necessarily and potentially quite positive, but the manner in which I did it wasn't, because the reason I was inspired to do that was because it seemed like doing so, at least in hindsight, was a compensation for a deep sense of inadequacy and a deep sense of needing to feel special and a deep sense of needing to prove my self-worth. And I guess I found in Terence McKenna, in sort of a combination of my own interests in the hero's journey and my own interests in travel and adventure, and also, like I said, Indiana Jones. I loved Indiana Jones growing up and I wanted to be just like him. And in Terence, I found the possibility of being that of the mind, taking these deep and crazy psychedelic journeys and coming back with something interesting to talk about it. But because this was a compensation for, a deep lacking inside of myself, I ended up pushing myself too far multiple times and got myself in trouble. I mean, really right from the beginning, I just took way too many drugs too often and ended up with drug-induced psychosis, which positively impacted me because it led me on this spiritual journey of how do I fix these things that I accidentally did, these damages I've done to my mind and my sense of self and all this reckless drug use. But that was the first. And then later, multiple times, I ended up just taking too much as an attempt to prove something to myself, as an attempt to do something extreme, do something wild, do something adventurous. And that wasn't positive. I ended up, with post-traumatic stress disorder after an event in 2014, and I just kept pushing it, and it just kind of kept making it worse. And I mean, thankfully, in the long view, those injuries became a gift, because having chosen, I guess, psychedelics as the adventurous lifestyle, or as a part of an adventurous lifestyle, it also offered me a gateway to somehow the things that caused me harm being the same things that led to my healing. So it wasn't all bad, but at the very first, it was bad. And in the long run, thankfully, I was able to check a lot of these things that I had going on in my head, these assumptions and these compensations, as an extension of some, really important criticisms I heard of the people I was most inspired by, and also the criticisms of myself that came with some very powerful psychedelic journeys and the desperate attempt to take care of the damage that I had done. I learned some valuable lessons, so I don't regret or have remorse for any of the decisions I made on this path, because I feel like it's added to me as a person and really contributed to, psychedelics have become my life path in a way, and my career path, and has helped me positively inspire a lot of people's lives by speaking about my process around them. So again, I have no regret, but at the same time, if I had been given a little bit of constructive criticism and appropriate feedback for where I was coming from in regards to my relationship to Terence McKenna, and I hadn't just absorbed it so deeply so quickly, I might not have ended up harming myself in the process. Although I also wouldn't be the person I am today. So this kind of goes into this third role. Like I said, in the beginning, McKenna was my role model because I wanted to be just like him. And I wanted him, he was the template that I was trying to step into in my career and in the way that I engaged my experience in the world, my sense of self, my sense of purpose. And then he eventually became the antithesis of where I wanted to go. He was the role model that showed me what not to do. And I was very negative about it for a long time. And then in recently having interviewed James Kent and listened to a fairly damning description of Terence McKenna's life that is featured in James Kent's first episode of the last 10 episodes of Dose Nation, his podcast series, I really started to wonder, what's up with Terence? Where am I now? I haven't really thought about him in a while. And so I did start thinking about him and started listening to his work again. And the place that I'm at now is he's still kind of a role model. He's a role model as an example of what I don't end up wanting to do. I don't want to end up alienated and alone, and I don't want to end up in the long run becoming the very thing that I spoke out against in my life, which, for McKenna is having become a cultural guru. But at the same time, I also see that he was an explorer of consciousness, and he was a product of his time with a lot of his new age ideas, but at the same point, he was also beyond his time. It's hard to look back at someone in history and give them a thorough criticism and blame them and shame them for having wild and crazy ideas when they were the first people to start having these ideas. Not very many other people were talking about what the possible nature of the psychedelic or the DMT type experience could be. And I really want to applaud him for taking the leap of faith to go there. Another thing is that his language was just so beautiful. His capacity for poetry and narrative and engaging story and sentences and phrases that just spark a person into wonder and wow is untouched by most people in this world. To me, being able to speak with such eloquence and beauty and sense of magic in the very capacity of how one constructs language it's great. Ultimately, the problem was never Terence. The problem is us. The problem is how we engage this work and the desperation that we grasp to his ideas and the means by which we appropriate some of his ideas and hyperbolize them and put them in a cultural context in which they didn't originally exist and represent them as being Terence's ideas when perhaps they were Terence's ideas, but they weren't necessarily meant to be Maybe they weren't necessarily meant to be taken the way that we're taking them. And maybe if McKenna was alive today, he wouldn't actually want us. Like, maybe he would have sung his song differently. Maybe he would have taken a different stance over time. Maybe he would have let go of novelty theory when 2012 came and went and the world didn't, radically change. The reality and the criticism here and the balance of where he's at as a role model in my life looks something like this. Some of the things Terence said was a bunch of flowery bullshit, which is fantastic to listen to as entertainment, but should not be taken seriously. Other things that Terence said are very astute and accurate and poignant considerations on the nature of society, on the nature of life, and on the nature of the psychedelic experience. And we need to learn, we as consumers of his content, of the listeners of his audio, the readers of his book, we need to learn discernment between what was the truth and what was just wild, metaphysical, poetic conjecture. And I think that this has to do with taking a long, hard, beautiful, but difficult look at ourselves and what psychologically inspires our behavior. And I don't think that this can be found in spiritual New Ageism, and I don't think that it can be found necessarily in flowery language, although it can be found in the reflection on the creative process. I think it can be found in getting very, very real with who we are and facing the uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Which is where my inspiration for the type of life and capacity of Terence McKenna as an orator meets my desire not to become and, reiterate his story. So determining the truth from the unsubstantiated conjecture and enjoying the poetic linguistic gymnastics in between, that's kind of where I'm at right now with Terence McKenna. So to end this video, I'm just going to offer a little bit of a paraphrase of a quote from Terence that I think is quite good, which is something along the lines of, it is no great feat to hear a voice in the head. The feat is determining if what it speaks is true. So thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the little thumbs up. When you do that, it enables more people on the subscriber list to see it in their feed. And of course, this is currently a fairly small YouTube channel, so any support that you offer is really incredible. And since it talks about drugs, it's often demonetized, so there isn't really capacity to make money on ads here to basically economically nourish the complexities of putting in time and technology into producing these videos for you. So hitting a thumbs up or sharing it or dropping a comment below this video is really supportive, so thank you very much for doing that. You can also support this channel in a directly economic way by donating through PayPal or through some form of cryptocurrency. Links to that are in the description below. You could also become my patron on Patreon. The link to that is also in the description below. And one of the rewards for being a patron is the capacity to suggest topics for me to talk about here on videos, so you can hear my thoughts on various things around psychedelics, mental health, trauma, sexuality, etc. Yeah. So again, thank you very much. Take care.
All kinds of things. And as soon as you put words to it, reality emerges. So you see, here is language as a double-edged sword. Out of the undifferentiated, it creates miraculous new realities to which we immediately habituate, undervalue, and profane. In other words, familiarity breeds contempt. But somewhere between silence and the familiarity that breeds contempt is the living essence of the word and its meaning.